Yes, let's talk about hockey, the show that journeys through the history of the sport of ice hockey from its disputed origins to the game we see today. Continuing our look at the four former WHA teams that joined the NHL after the two leagues merged in 1979, we come to the franchise that first started out in Boston and took a name that not only paid tribute to the Massachusetts seaport towns, but also began with the letters WHA, the Whalers.
Originally dubbed the New England Whalers, the club was another one of the few faces of stability during the WHA's short time and managed to win divisional titles in their first 3 seasons, as well as the league's first Avco Cup championship in 1973. Though they would only win the Avco Cup once, they made it into the playoffs each year and made it back to the championship finals 2 other times in 1976 and 1978. After the WHA and NHL merger, the Whalers were very fortunate in retaining a good number of their star players during the dispersal draft, such as Dave Kean and Andre Lacroix, as well as the 3 Hows, Mark, Marty, and Gordy. However, following lobbying from the Boston Bruins, one of the conditions of the merger stipulated that the Whalers had to drop New England from their name. So, since the club had moved from Boston to Hartford in 1974, they rebranded themselves as the Hartford Whalers before their first season as an NHL club. Though their first game as a member of the NHL on October 11, 1979, ended in a 4-1 loss to the Minnesota North Stars, the Whalers improved going forward from there. Not only would they make a late-season acquisition of Bobby Hull from Winnipeg, but the 285 combined points produced by Mike Rogers, Blaine Stoughton, and Mark Howe allowed Hartford to finish the year with the best record of the 4 former WHA clubs and nab the final playoff spot in the Wales Conference. Unfortunately, they were matched against the 4-time defending champions from Montreal in the first round, and were outscored 18-8 in a 3-game sweep. Following this playoff defeat, Gordie Howe, Bobby Hull, and Andre Lacroix all announced their retirements, and backup goaltender Al Smith, who had been the club's starter through 5 seasons in the WHA, was dealt to Colorado. Though Hartford's inaugural NHL season had been promising, their second year in 1980-81 was less so. In addition to a 9-game winless streak in early November, their inability to win more than 8 games from January through April killed any chances the Whalers had of making the playoffs that year. Subpar performances would continue to plague the team over the next 4 seasons, and to make matters worse, the Whalers' management began to make disastrous trades in an attempt to gain depth in their roster, such as dealing their leading scorers Mike Rogers and Mark Howe to the Rangers and Flyers respectively for draft picks that ultimately wouldn't pan out.
Though the Whalers had premiered promising young forwards Ron Francis and Sylvain Turgeon during this time period, they wouldn't receive much help until Kevin Dineen, Ulf Samuelsson, and Ray Ferraro made their rookie debuts in the 1984-85 season. Additionally, Hartford acquired goaltender Mike Liut and veteran center Doug Jarvis to further strengthen the roster. In the 1985-86 season, Turgeon, Ferraro, Francis, and Dineen would comprise the team's top 4 scorers with 301 combined points, leading the Whalers to their first winning season since joining the NHL and back into the playoffs after a 5-year absence.
For the opening round, Hartford was matched against their division's top team, the Quebec Nordiques. Despite Quebec's higher ranking, these 2 teams were evenly matched against each other during the regular season, and in the first game, this trend continued. But thanks to goaltender Mike Liut's performance, the game headed into overtime, where Sylvain Turgeon netted the game winner. Hartford proceeded to outscore Quebec 13-5 over the next 2 games after that to complete the upset and win their first NHL playoff series. Moving on to the Divisional Finals, Hartford was again matched against Montreal. Thanks to Kevin Dineen, John Anderson, and Ray Ferraro's offensive numbers, as well as Mike Liut's goaltending, the Whalers were able to push their series against Montreal to a decisive Game 7. Though Hartford trailed 1-0 for most of this game, Dave Babich managed to tie things up with 2 minutes and 48 seconds left in the third period to send the game into overtime. Unfortunately, 5 minutes into the overtime period, Montreal scored to end the game and eliminate the Whalers from the playoffs. Despite this playoff disappointment, Hartford looked to build upon their success in the 1986-87 season. That year, Doug Jarvis would break an NHL record when he played in his 915th consecutive game, an achievement that also earned him the Bill Masterton Trophy that year. Francis, Dineen, and Anderson continued to lead the team in scoring, and the Whalers not only put together another winning season, but also nabbed the regular season title for the Adams Division. Entering the playoffs that year, they were again matched against the Quebec Nordiques and won the first 2 games of the series to build up an early lead. However, things unraveled for Hartford over the next 4 games, as both teams set records for penalty minutes in a single playoff game as well as in a whole playoff series. Quebec would outscore the Whalers 21-11 over these games and clinch the series after Peter Stastny's overtime goal in Game 6. After this playoff disappointment, Hartford would post sub-500 records over the next 2 seasons and suffer first-round playoff defeats against the Montreal Canadiens both years as well. In the 1989-90 season, though, the Whalers, led by Ron Francis's career-high 101 points, and despite losing star goaltender Mike Liut in a questionable trade deadline deal, posted their club's 3rd winning season since joining the NHL. For the first time ever, the Whalers faced their New England area rival, the Boston Bruins, in the playoffs. Hartford was able to establish a 2-1 series lead with wins in games 1 and 3, and with a 5-2 lead entering the 3rd period of Game 4, had grabbed a pretty good hold on the series. But goaltending would play a big factor in the remainder of the series, as the Bruins replaced the struggling Reggie Lemlin with Andy Moog to start that 3rd period. Moog would stand strong, denying every shot he faced in the period, while Peter Sidorkovich began to struggle for the Whalers and allowed 4 unanswered goals as Boston completed a dramatic 3rd period comeback to win the game 6-5. The teams traded wins over the next 2 games to tie the series at 3, but Boston pulled out a 3-1 Game 7 victory to hand Hartford another bitter playoff defeat.
A dismantling of the team's core began after this, as Joel Quenneville, Ray Ferraro, Ulf Samuelsson, and even team captain Ron Francis were all dealt to other teams throughout the 1990-91 season. These moves were highly criticized by the Whalers fan base since Francis was the most popular player on the team, and the trade of him and Ulf Samuelsson was made even more painful when they helped lead Pittsburgh to the 1991 Stanley Cup title, while the Whalers themselves suffered a first-round elimination at the hands of Boston yet again.
The high-profile trades continued into the 1991-92 season, with Kevin Dineen getting dealt to Philadelphia in early November. Though Hartford's record declined to 26-41-13 this year, they still managed to beat out Quebec for the final playoff spot in the Adams Division. Up against the highly favored Montreal Canadiens, Hartford dropped the first 2 games in the series by 2-0 and 5-2 scores, leading many to believe Montreal would easily sweep them aside. However, the Whalers returned home and responded in kind with 5-2 and 3-1 wins in games 3 and 4 to even the series. In Game 5 back in Montreal, the Whalers had established a 3-1 lead midway through the game. However, the Canadiens rallied and scored 4 unanswered goals in the final 5 minutes of the 2nd period, and then another 2 in the 3rd to win the game 7-4. But Hartford again tied the series at home in their next game thanks to Yvan Korovo's goal 24 seconds into the game's overtime period. In Game 7, the Whalers again took the Canadiens into overtime. However, this time it was Russ Courtnall of the Canadiens who scored the game's winner in the 2nd overtime period to dash Hartford's playoff hopes once again. After this, head coach Jimmy Roberts and GM Eddie Johnston, who had orchestrated many of the poor trade deals over the past 3 years, were fired, and Brian Burke was brought on as the new GM. As one of his first acts, Burke hired former Flyers coach Paul Holmgren as the Whalers' new head coach. Holmgren named Pat Verbeek as the team's new captain and paired him on a line with budding forwards Andrew Castles and Jeff Sanderson. Additionally, they acquired goaltender Sean Burke from New Jersey and premiered another young talented center named Michael Nylander. Unfortunately, these changes didn't turn in immediate results, as the Whalers dropped to 5th in their division during the 1992-93 season and failed to make the playoffs for the first time in 7 years. Hopes were higher for the 1993-94 season, with the younger core that was assembled the previous year, as well as the new additions of veteran defenseman Brad McCrimmon and rookie defenseman Chris Pronger.
But disagreements between GM Brian Burke and owner Richard Gordon led Burke to resign his position and take an executive position in the NHL. This left Holmgren with both the GM and head coaching duties, which eventually became too much for him. So after winning only 4 of their first 17 games that year, he named Pierre McGuire as the new head coach. The coaching change did not help though, since McGuire was not popular with the players. Additionally, off-ice incidents, like 6 players and 2 assistant coaches getting arrested for involvement in a barroom brawl, and GM Paul Holmgren checking himself into rehab for alcoholism, only made matters worse, as Hartford again finished near the bottom of their division and out of the playoffs for a second consecutive year.
Following this disappointment, the team was sold to CompuWare CEO Peter Karmanos in the summer of 1994. One of his partners, Jim Rutherford, was named the team's new general manager, and Holmgren returned as the head coach. Wanting to turn the team around for the 1994-95 season, Rutherford signed veteran center Jimmy Carson, selected winger Jeff O'Neill in the first round of the draft, and acquired defenseman Glenn Wesley from Boston for 3 first-round draft picks. Despite these additions, the Whalers got off to a rocky start with a 2-7-2 record. Things began to improve, though, with the Sanderson, Castles, and Verbeek line, along with goaltender Sean Burke leading the team over the next 18 games. Despite this, though, the Whalers dealt Verbeek to the Rangers for Glenn Featherstone, Michael Stewart, and 2 draft picks. Surprisingly, Hartford continued to perform well over the next 12 games, but unfortunately, things fell apart after that as the Whalers' poor play down the stretch earned them only 1 win in their final 7 games and left them out of the playoffs by 4 points. After falling short on expectations, the Whalers dealt Chris Pronger to St. Louis during the offseason for star forward Brendan Shanahan, who was then named as the new team captain. In the 1995-96 season, Hartford once again started out with promise, winning their first 4 games. However, despite the 206 combined points from Shanahan, Sanderson, and Castles, a coaching change, and the return of Kevin Dineen to the roster, the 5 winless streaks of 4 or more games throughout the season doomed the team's playoff hopes for another year.
Things turned even more sour for the club during the offseason as Shanahan became vocal with his displeasure about playing in Hartford and demanded a trade. Subsequently, his team captaincy was stripped and given to Kevin Dineen, and he was dealt to Detroit for Keith Primo, Paul Coffey, and a first-round draft pick. To make matters worse, the club had been struggling financially due to being in the smallest American market, as well as sharing some of that market with the nearby Bruins, Rangers, and Islanders. So, a frustrated Karmanos had announced prior to the previous year that if the Whalers didn't sell enough season tickets for the 1996-97 season, he would likely move the team elsewhere.
However, seemingly determined to rise above these problems, the Whalers started off the 1996-97 season going 14-7-6 in their first 27 games, earning them the top ranking in their division. Unfortunately, things again began to slip away after that. Hartford went on a 9-game winless streak after the new year, and then suffered a 6-game losing streak in the latter half of March. Despite these streaks, the Whalers still were within playoff contention with 3 games left in the season. However, they lost the first 2 of those 3 games to Ottawa and the Islanders, ending any hopes of sneaking into the postseason. Off the ice, last-minute demands by Karmanos caused negotiations with the city for a new arena to break down, and it was announced that the Whalers would be leaving Hartford at the end of the season, even though Karmanos had yet to find a new city to move to. So, on April 13, 1997, the Whalers played their last game in Hartford, beating Tampa Bay 2-1, with team captain Kevin Dineen scoring the final goal in Whalers history. Less than a month later, on May 6, 1997, Karmanos announced the team would move to Raleigh, North Carolina to play as the Carolina Hurricanes for the 1997-98 season. Though the club has only made the playoffs 5 times in the 18 seasons since their relocation to Carolina, they were able to advance as far as the finals on 2 of those occasions and finally claim a Stanley Cup title in 2006. While back in Hartford, though the city lost its NHL club, it gained a club in the American Hockey League immediately afterwards, as the Binghamton Rangers set up shop there in 1997. Renamed the Wolfpack, this new club has not only brought in 4 division titles and a Calder Cup championship, but has also kept hockey alive in the city of Hartford.